Zimbabweans are capable of spearheading game-changing, first-of-a-kind innovations that challenge the world's traditional ways of doing things.
What if the world's most powerful automakers, Tesla, GM, even Volkswagen, just got outmaneuvered by a self-taught inventor in Zimbabwe?
The powertrain, we did it in-house, which makes it the first electric vehicle in the world that drives without needing recharging systems.
Maxwell Chikumbutso's car needs no charging, no fuel, no battery swaps, just pure self-sustaining energy.
Generator, and even a helicopter that ran on radio frequencies. A true free energy device that keeps batteries consistently charged. It took me several months to find him, but when I did, it blew my mind.
Witnesses call it disturbingly efficient, while Elon Musk's stunned reaction sparked global panic. If this tech is real, it won't just kill the battery industry. It could collapse oil empires, disrupt trillions in infrastructure, and flip geopolitics upside down. Ready to see the invention that shouldn't exist but might change everything? Keep watching. The unlikely inventor. While Silicon Valley was perfecting battery technology, a Zimbabwean inventor was working on something that could make batteries themselves obsolete. Maxwell Chikumbutso has spent over a decade being dismissed by mainstream science, labeled a dreamer, and sidelined by an industry that couldn't comprehend what he was building. But Chikumbutso never stopped. His company, Scythe Technologies, has been demonstrating these vehicles since approximately 2015, with public demonstrations in Zimbabwe drawing local attention but limited international scrutiny until recent years. Known for his earlier ventures into green technology and alternative energy solutions, his reputation as a nonconformist inventor has now reached its peak with this latest creation. The vehicle he's developed doesn't just improve on existing systems, it completely bypasses them. Powered by what he describes as a revolutionary electromagnetic energy conversion system, the car synthesizes electromagnetic waves and converts them into usable electric energy. No external charging, no fuel stops, no battery swaps. The car sustains itself operating indefinitely without needing anything from the outside world. Demonstration footage available online shows the vehicles operating without visible charging ports or fuel systems, though no independent technical assessment has been published in peer-reviewed literature. The inventor threatening to bankrupt Tesla, GM, and Volkswagen is a self-taught engineer who built his prototype in a Harare workshop using second-hand equipment, and the fact that major automotive powers never saw him coming might be the most expensive oversight in industrial history. He guarded technical details closely, citing concerns about intellectual theft, which only deepened skepticism. Without peer-reviewed validation or transparent breakdowns, his work sat on the margins, noticed by few and trusted by fewer. That changed the moment Elon Musk made a public reaction. Overnight, what had been ignored was suddenly examined. When the most influential figure in electric vehicles acknowledges the possibility of disruption, curiosity replaces dismissal. Analysts who would have previously ignored a prototype from Zimbabwe began paying attention, not because the claims were proven, but because the stakes were now impossible to ignore. The financial implications became immediately clear. Traditional vehicle ownership costs average between $15,000 and $20,000 over a decade when factoring in fuel, maintenance, and battery replacement. Electric vehicles reduce that figure somewhat, but still require charging costs and eventual battery replacement, averaging $8,000 to $15,000. A truly self-powered vehicle could reduce lifetime energy costs to near zero, fundamentally altering consumer economics and forcing automakers to compete on radically different terms. The global automotive industry, valued at approximately $3 trillion annually, suddenly faces a competitor that has invalidated its entire cost structure. More unsettling still was the location. This breakthrough was not emerging from Silicon Valley or a state-backed research hub, but from a place the global tech industry rarely watches. It challenges assumptions about where innovation can originate and who gets to redefine the rules. But the real threat wasn't where he came from or how he built it. The threat was what he claimed the car could actually do. And that's where the laws of physics themselves started breaking down in ways that terrified scientists more than excited them. When physics pushes back, for over a century the laws of thermodynamics have been clear. Energy cannot be created from nothing, and every system loses usable energy over time. Following this law, this invention promising endless output without external fuel or charging is immediately flagged as impossible. That framework has protected science from fraudulent claims, but it's also why Chikumbutso's demonstrations triggered institutional alarm rather than curiosity. Researchers are unsettled by the report of witnesses. Observers describe vehicles running steadily with no visible energy input, no draining battery, and no obvious external feed. The proposed explanation centers on capturing ambient electromagnetic activity, the low-level waves already filling the environment from natural and man-made sources, then amplifying and recycling that energy in real time. In simple terms, it does not claim to create energy, but to continuously collect what already exists and reuse it with extreme efficiency. That distinction is where the battle begins. If the system is truly harvesting ambient energy at a scale large enough to power motion, it does not break thermodynamics outright, but it stretches current models to their limits. Concepts like resonance amplification, electromagnetic coupling, and zero-point energy extraction, previously confined to theoretical physics margins, suddenly demand serious examination. Behind closed doors, researchers split into camps. Some argue that hidden batteries, delayed discharge, or measurement gaps could account for observed performance. Others quietly explore whether conventional models might be incomplete. What prevents immediate dismissal is the documented footage, vehicles operating continuously across multiple demonstrations without visible power sources. Either the demonstrations conceal hidden energy sources, or the conventional understanding of energy harvesting efficiency is incomplete. The unspoken tension is this: if independent testing confirms the effect, physics does not collapse, but it changes. Models expand, assumptions tighten, and new boundaries are drawn. But that process requires someone to risk funding and reputation on testing a system the establishment has already labeled impossible. And that's where the scientific process stalls when industrial interests prefer it stay buried. But while physicists debated whether the technology violated natural laws or simply exposed gaps in current understanding, engineers who actually ran the numbers discovered something that made the theoretical debate irrelevant. Because the scale of energy amplification Chikumbutso was claiming required physics that didn't just stretch the models, it shattered them completely. And understanding those numbers is what reveals why this either changes everything or exposes the most sophisticated technical deception ever constructed: the power source that should not work. What disturbed engineers wasn't just that the system appeared to violate energy conservation laws. It was that after months of analysis, no one could definitively explain what trick was being used, and that uncertainty was somehow more alarming, because on paper, this power source should not be enough to move a car at all. According to Chikumbutso, the system draws energy from ambient electromagnetic waves, the background radiation from radio transmissions, telecommunications infrastructure, and other emissions constantly present in modern environments. To understand the scale challenge, ambient electromagnetic radiation in urban environments typically measures less than 1 microwatt per square meter. A moving car requires 15,000 to 30,000 watts continuous, meaning Chikumbutso claims to be capturing and amplifying energy by a factor of roughly 30 billion. He describes it as a microsonic energy system that amplifies these typically weak signals into continuous usable power. Rather than storing energy in large batteries that drain over time, the vehicle draws power continuously as it operates, creating what he calls a closed-loop system. The concept challenges conventional engineering because ambient electromagnetic energy is generally considered too diffuse and weak for vehicle propulsion, which is why no major automaker has pursued it. Available demonstration footage shows vehicles operating without visible external charging connections, though the recordings do not include energy measurement equipment that would verify zero external power input. The absence of engine noise and the lack of battery depletion are what fuel the mystery. If the system functions as claimed, it would eliminate the most expensive and limiting parts of electric vehicle ownership: charging infrastructure, range anxiety, and battery replacement. Chikumbutso has kept technical schematics, performance data, and internal measurements tightly restricted, citing intellectual property concerns. That secrecy has drawn criticism from scientists who argue that extraordinary claims require transparent testing and independent verification. Without that scrutiny, the technology sits in an uncomfortable space between breakthrough and impossibility. The stakes explain the tension. If ambient energy harvesting could be scaled to power vehicles reliably, entire supply chains would be disrupted. Lithium mining, cobalt extraction, large-scale battery manufacturing, and national charging networks would no longer sit at the center of the transition away from fossil fuels. Even incremental success would force automakers to rethink designs they have spent decades and trillions building. This is why the reaction has been so polarized. Supporters see a leap beyond incremental progress, while skeptics see a violation of basic energy limits. But whether the science holds up or collapses under scrutiny becomes almost irrelevant when you realize what it would instantly make worthless if it works. And that list is longer and more devastating than most people understand. The collapse scenario. The most unsettling part of this invention is not the technology itself, but what it would instantly make worthless. Every major automaker has built its electric future around one core assumption: vehicles will always depend on large batteries that must be charged, replaced, and supported by extensive energy infrastructure. Tesla, General Motors, Ford, and Volkswagen have committed over $200 billion collectively to battery factories, long-term lithium and cobalt supply contracts, and charging networks designed to lock drivers into their ecosystems. These investments assume battery technology remains central to electric mobility through 2040, an assumption that self-powered vehicles would invalidate, turning state-of-the-art factories into obsolete infrastructure within years. Their entire strategic roadmap assumes incremental improvement in battery chemistry and charging speed, not replacement of the battery paradigm itself. If a vehicle can operate without large battery packs, without scheduled charging, and without degradation over time, then the most expensive components of today's electric vehicle strategy lose value overnight. Factories optimized for battery production become stranded assets. Charging infrastructure becomes optional rather than essential. Years of planning and hundreds of billions in capital expenditure transform into sunk costs that cannot be recovered. But that's not all. The risk escalates when applied to commercial use. Fleets operate on uptime and cost per mile, not brand loyalty. Commercial electric vehicle fleets currently allocate 2 to 4 hours per vehicle daily for charging, limiting operational hours. Continuous operation would increase productive time by 15 to 25%, creating competitive pressure that would force rapid industry adoption if the technology proves viable. Even marginal adoption would pressure logistics companies, delivery services, and public transport operators to reconsider existing contracts and future purchases. This is why the reaction inside the industry would not be gradual curiosity, but urgent damage control. Adapting would mean abandoning platforms still being rolled out, rewriting supply chains midstream, and conceding that previous investments were built on a model that no longer holds. Failing to adapt risks the same fate that hit companies that ignored smartphones, digital cameras, or streaming media until it was too late. Tesla faces particular exposure, with its business model entirely dependent on battery production, supercharger networks, and energy storage. If self-sustaining vehicles prove viable, even Tesla's advantages become liabilities, and the disruption does not stop with cars. Once vehicles no longer rely on the grid, the shock ripples outward into energy markets, mining operations, and national infrastructure planning. The automotive collapse is only the opening act, because once vehicles stop depending on external energy, the shockwave moves outward into every industry that burns fuel or draws power from the grid. and that chain reaction could redraw the entire global economy. The chain reaction that could unplug the world. The question is not whether this technology changes cars, but what happens if it does not stop there? If Chikumbutso's energy harvesting system can be scaled beyond personal vehicles, the next targets are the most energy-hungry machines on Earth. Cargo ships that currently burn large quantities of fuel could operate without refueling. Long-haul aviation, built around constant fuel consumption and refuel stops, would face an entirely new operating model. Even partial success in these sectors would collapse cost structures that have remained unchanged for decades. From there, the disruption moves inland. Logistics companies would no longer measure efficiency by fuel contracts or charging schedules, but by uninterrupted runtime. Manufacturing plants could operate independent of national grids, insulating themselves from outages, price spikes, and supply shocks. Energy would shift from being a recurring operating expense to a fixed capability, changing how companies plan, price, and compete. The automotive, petroleum, and electric utility industries combined represent approximately $10 trillion in annual global economic activity. Displacement of even 10 to 15% of this scale would constitute one of history's largest industrial transitions, though this assumes technical validation, manufacturing scale-up, and market adoption, none of which have occurred. Utility companies in developed nations generate $2 trillion in annual revenue, much of it from residential and commercial electricity distribution. If even 20% of these sectors face displacement within a decade, the financial disruption would exceed $10 trillion, making it one of the largest industrial transitions in human history. The implications grow sharper when applied at the community level. Scaled systems installed in homes or neighborhoods would reduce reliance on centralized grids altogether. Regions that struggle with unstable power would no longer need massive infrastructure projects to achieve reliable electricity. Rural and underserved areas could gain continuous access to power without waiting for transmission lines, fuel deliveries, or political approval. But shifts of this scale never remain technical. Energy is power in the literal sense. Nations built around resource exports would face instability, while others race to secure control over the components and intellectual property behind this system. But industrial disruption is only half the story, because when energy becomes abundant and decentralized, political power starts moving in directions that terrify governments built on controlling access to resources. And that's where this stops being about cars and starts becoming about who rules the future. When energy loses its grip on power, if verified at scale, self-powered vehicles would reduce petroleum demand, pressuring oil-dependent economies. However, this assumes technical validation, global manufacturing capacity, infrastructure replacement, and mass adoption, cascading requirements that have not materialized. The disruption creates unlikely winners. Zimbabwe shifts from overlooked to central. African nations without legacy infrastructure can leapfrog development phases entirely. Emerging regions suddenly compete not as resource suppliers but as innovation centers, flipping decades of assumptions about where technological power originates. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa begin to look less like markets and more like launch points. Manufacturing, adaptation, and local deployment become realistic paths, not distant goals. Beyond Africa, emerging regions gain an advantage. Nations without deep investments in oil infrastructure or aging power grids can move faster, skipping entire phases of development. Trade agreements start shifting away from fuel supply and toward technology access. Development strategies pivot from extraction to independence. As influence redraws itself, raw resources lose weight while engineering and intellectual property gain it. Power no longer flows from what is buried underground, but from who controls systems that make energy abundant. And the moment that reality became clear, the race to seize control turned vicious. Because in a disruption this large, being second doesn't mean losing market share, it means extinction. And that urgency transformed what should have been scientific inquiry into something far more dangerous. The scramble begins. What started as a race for competitive advantage quickly revealed itself as something far more ruthless. Because once the geopolitical implications became clear, the scramble for control stopped following any rules. And the tactics being deployed were designed not to compete with this technology, but to ensure it never reaches the public at all. Online, engineers and researchers tore into every frame of available demonstrations, arguing over measurements, assumptions, and whether the system hid something unseen. At the same time, investors began moving quietly, probing for early access, private meetings, or acquisition paths before the public narrative fully settled. Even established automakers, many still publicly cautious, started exploring licensing conversations behind closed doors, not out of belief, but out of fear of being last to react. If independently verified, the technology would raise fundamental questions about battery supply chain investments. However, as of late 2024, no major automotive manufacturers or battery producers have publicly altered strategic plans in response to these demonstrations. The discussion moved fast, from whether the system was possible to how quickly it could spread if it proved real. Media coverage followed the same arc. Early skepticism gave way to speculative planning. Reports began outlining how cities might function without dense networks of charging stations, how vehicle maintenance models could change, and how insurance firms might assess machines designed to run without traditional wear patterns tied to fuel systems. Regulators, meanwhile, faced a problem they had no framework for: vehicles with no measurable energy intake to certify or monitor. Current EPA fuel economy testing measures kilowatt-hours consumed per 100 miles for electric vehicles. A vehicle claiming zero external energy input would fall outside all existing certification categories, requiring entirely new testing protocols. Public reaction split sharply. Some dismissed the entire idea as an illusion. Others became increasingly curious as more demonstrations circulated. That growing curiosity triggered resistance from entrenched energy interests, which pushed calls for prolonged testing, safety reviews, and procedural delays. The tactics were familiar: slow the process, seed doubt, and buy time. Another conflict surfaced just as quickly: ownership. Chikumbutso argued for broad access so the technology would not deepen global inequality. But pressure mounted from governments and institutions, viewing it as critical infrastructure. Discussions around compulsory licensing, patent limitations, and international oversight intensified, especially as climate and energy security entered the conversation. Beyond civilian use, military and aerospace analysts began mapping applications that never depend on resupply, from long-duration drones to deep space exploration platforms. The implications stretched far beyond transportation. But all the corporate positioning and regulatory scrambling misses the larger point, because if this technology reaches even partial adoption, it doesn't just change industries. It changes what it means to be free from energy scarcity. And that transformation carries consequences most people haven't begun to imagine. What we're about to watch unfold. Independent third-party testing will ultimately determine validity. Credible verification requires continuous energy monitoring, operation in electromagnetically shielded environments to confirm energy sources, and peer review of underlying mechanisms, none of which has been publicly documented. The challenge lies in balancing intellectual property protection with scientific validation. If credible third-party testing confirms continuous power generation without external input, skepticism collapses and industrial panic accelerates. If testing reveals hidden batteries, external power feeds, or measurement errors, the story ends and attention shifts elsewhere. That binary outcome makes the verification process itself a high-stakes event. Production timelines will tell the next part of the story. Chikumbutso has indicated intentions to move toward commercial manufacturing, but scaling from prototype to mass production requires capital, supply chains, and manufacturing partnerships that don't yet exist. Traditional automakers moving into partnership or licensing discussions would signal they're taking the threat seriously. Conversely, continued isolation and lack of major backing might indicate technical barriers that demonstrations haven't revealed. But that's not all. Financial markets will react to concrete developments. If major investment firms take substantial positions in scythe technologies or adjacent companies, it signals confidence in technical viability. If battery manufacturers or oil companies begin aggressive lobbying campaigns, legal challenges, or public relations efforts to discredit the technology, it suggests they view it as a genuine threat worth fighting. Public adoption will be the ultimate test. Early buyers willing to take risks on unproven technology will determine whether the vehicles perform as claimed in daily use across varied conditions, climates, and driving patterns. User reports, maintenance records, and long-term performance data will either validate or destroy the claims. The timeline matters. If progress stalls, skepticism hardens. If momentum builds, resistance intensifies. Either way, the next chapter is being written right now, and the signals are there for anyone paying close attention to follow. What distinguishes this from past claims? The demonstrations are documented across years, the physics problem is clearly defined, and the potential impact, if proven, would exceed any automotive disruption in history. The question remains whether physics allows what the footage appears to show. So here's the question. Do you think this invention will truly destroy the car industry or fade like others? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you can stay ahead of what happens next. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.